Mr. President.
Senator from North Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, 6 months ago, our nation's small businesses faced an existential crisis and an unprecedented threat. And like the rest of us, they didn't truly know what this virus was, how hard it would hit us, how long it would last, or what the future would hold. But they did know that their businesses were preparing to close, that employees were being told to stay home, and they needed help, which is why I and every other colleague in this chamber passed the CARES Act and created the Paycheck Protection Program. We gave money to the administration, who in turn gave that money to lenders, and those lenders in turn loaned that money to small businesses to use on employee retention. And if they followed the rules, they were told they wouldn't have to return the money. That was the commitment we made to them, while we strongly encouraged them, and I emphasize strongly encouraged them, to use the program, and it worked. We got nearly 5 million PPP loans worth $571 billion out the door and into the hands of our businesses, who put it into the hands of their employees, which kept tens of millions of people on some counts on the payrolls instead of on the unemployment rolls. Now, history will be the judge of the long-term success of the program for sure, but it's unquestionable that in the short term, this program succeeded. It's time for us now, Mr. President, to uphold our commitment. America's lenders and borrowers are ready to take that next step, proving that they complied with the rules so they can receive forgiveness for these loans. But sadly for them, but not surprising to me, the forgiveness process designed by the agency is burdensome, complex, and already in need of reform. Now, that's not just my opinion, Mr. President. That is the opinion of the Government Accountability Office. They said, quote, "Applying for loan forgiveness is more time-consuming than applying for the PP loan itself and requires more lender review," unquote. Mr. President, you see the trap that we've laid for our borrowers and lenders here. We, the federal government, spent weeks, months, telling our hurting, fragile small businesses, take this money, just use it correctly, and it will be forgiven. Well, here we are, our businesses still struggling, still facing uncertainty, and the agency-prescribed solution appears to be creating a system more intense than any they have experienced during this pandemic, just so they can prove to the right people that they didn't use their money incorrectly. And that's a problem, and we've known it's going to be a problem for a long time, and that's why we've been working on bipartisan solutions to the problems in this bipartisan program for months. Over the summer, Senator Menendez and I brought together a bipartisan coalition and introduced the Paycheck Protection Small Business Forgiveness Act. Here's what it does. Of those 5 million PPP recipients, 4.2 million had loans of $150,000 or less. Remember, they could borrow up to $10 million. They account for around $132 billion of the PPP funds that we've spent. Think about that, 4.2 million of the 5 million, so that 86% of the borrowers account for $132 billion of the $571 billion that we spent. That's only 27%. So what we did is we separated the 86% of the loans, which account for 27% of the money, and said, if borrowers, small businesses, complete a simple one-page forgiveness document to the lender, our banks, our credit unions, the loan would be forgiven. It's that simple. It eliminates the anxiety being felt by our businesses, it puts accountability on the borrowers, and it frees up enforcement efforts to focus on the 14% of the PPP recipients who took 73% of the funds. If this seems obvious and common sense, Mr. President, it's because it is. Congress isn't known for working well together, I know that. But here, a Republican from North Dakota teams up with a Democrat from New Jersey to find a plan that works for members from Arizona to Alabama, from North Carolina to Nebraska. Nearly a third of the Senate, with members from both parties, have signed on to our bill. So what's happened since? Well, you know as well as anybody, Mr. President, our friends blocked us from considering a new relief package just a couple of weeks ago. Many of the provisions of our bipartisan bill were in that package. Many bipartisan plans from all sectors were in it, but politics prevailed and we came up short. That happens around here. But just because our total package was blocked doesn't mean our small businesses and lenders who gave them PPP funds don't still need the relief. That's what we've heard from our communities and hundreds of association leaders from all across the country. So, on their behalf, on behalf of the small businesses who need help and the lenders we encouraged to help them, I'm going to be calling for unanimous consent to passage of S4117. So, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Small Business be discharged from further consideration of S4117 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the Johnson Amendment at the desk be considered and agreed to, the bill as amended be considered read a third time and passed, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Mr. President.
Is there objection?
Mr. President, I
Senator from Maryland.
reserve the right to object. Mr. President, I want to thank my friend, Senator Cramer, for bringing attention to this issue. I think he knows that the PPP program was included in the CARES Act. I take great pride working with Senator Rubio, a Republican, a Democrat, other members of our committee. We were the architects of the PPP program. It was bipartisan, and it was included in the CARES Act, and was enacted in March. It's very interesting that if we would have gone with the original bill that came out of the Republicans, that would not have been a bipartisan bill, much of the help for small businesses would not have been there in the CARES Act. It's only through bipartisan legislation that we're able to advance the type of tools that are necessary to help America's small businesses. I must tell you, the number one priority today for small businesses is to safely be able to resume full operations. They need it safe for parents and their children to be able to get back to school. They need for us to get this virus under control. So businesses that depend on large gatherings such as food services, hospitality, events, travel, and tourism can literally survive. The House took its action to help accomplish these goals last May when they passed the HEROES Act. And to this date, the Republican leader, Senator McConnell, has not allowed us to take up that comprehensive legislation that will help our country, help deal with the virus, help our economy, and help small businesses. Just today, Speaker Pelosi has updated the HEROES Act because it's been over 4 months since it was passed, so that we now have a HEROES Act that is within the range between what the Republicans had originally suggested and the Democrats had originally suggested. That's moving towards a bipartisan bill. That's what we need. Now, in the HEROES Act, there are so many provisions that are desperately needed for small business that are not in this unanimous consent request. Let me just point out a few. We need a second round of PPP. Businesses that have suffered significant revenue losses, the hardest hit, the smaller of the small businesses, need more help. The PPP program was designed for an 8-week pandemic. This pandemic is gone long beyond 8 weeks. The House legislation includes resources for mission lenders. Why do I mention that? Such as CDFIs and minority depository institutions. Because we have found that when you rely on the 7A commercial loans in order to get forgivable loans, those that are traditionally underserved are not able to get the same type of attention. Minority businesses, women-owned businesses, businesses in rural areas. So we need to pay special attention to providing additional resources and allocations to mission lenders. That's not included in the unanimous consent request. We need to expand PPP eligibility. We've heard from our nonprofits that were left out of the first round. They need to be included. Local newspapers were not included. Previously incarcerated individuals were denied certain help. The House legislation, the HEROES Act, makes those changes so that all eligible small businesses would be able to qualify for these loans. The Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, EIDL, is desperately in need of congressional attention. We have bipartisan support for significantly increasing the resources going into the EIDL program, Senator Corden and Senator Rosen, so that we can replenish the grants and provide the grants that are desperately needed for smaller small businesses, that we can eliminate that $150,000 arbitrary cap that was put on by the Small Business Administration that's contrary to law. We need to make it clear that the loans can be made up to $2 million under the EIDL program. We need to help state and local government. That's in the HEROES Act. It's not in the unanimous consent that's being suggested. Why do we have to help state and local government? Because their services are critically important for small businesses to be able to operate effectively. And the House bill provides a separate amount of funds so that the local governments can directly help small businesses. That's not included in the unanimous consent request. We can improve the 7A program, the 504 loan program, the microloan programs. They're in the House bill, not in the unanimous consent request. We've all heard from our live venue operators. They need help. They're going to close if we don't do something to help them. It's our responsibility to act. It's in the HEROES Act. It's not in the unanimous consent request. We need to expand the employee retention tax credit, which allows workers to be able to be retained by small businesses. That's expanded under the HEROES Act. It's not in the unanimous consent request. And I could go on and on and on about all the provisions that are necessary to help small businesses that we need to take up now. If we wait to after the elections, more small businesses will be shuttered forever. That's the number one priority for small businesses. Now, we also find that we need to help in regards to streamlining the process for loan forgiveness. I agree with my colleague. I agree that we need to simplify that process. I've had my arguments with the Small Business Administration, and so have those who oversight in the executive branch. We know what they did to the EIDL program. They didn't administer that the way we said, 3 days to process grants. They didn't do that. They didn't give us the data we needed so we could understand the program. So why do we have confidence that under your unanimous consent request, they'll do the right form? Because you give them the authority to issue the form. I'm not exactly sure that will work. But here's the good news. We want to do something in this area. Because you're right. Senator's right. We need to streamline the process. SBA is not doing it the way we intended it to be done. And the House took action. But the House action is a little bit different. The House have said, look, for those loans under $50,000, why don't we do it without any paper? Let them retain the records, but let's eliminate any possibility of the SBA delaying the loan forgiveness. I think that's one we should look at. We can't do that if we were to let this consent go forward. And then lastly, this consent deals also with a safe harbor for the PPP lenders. It would provide a safe harbor from claims under the Small Business Act, the False Claims Act, the Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery and Enforcement Act, the Federal Deposit Insurance Act, and the Bank Secrecy Act, or any other federal, state, or criminal or civil law regulations. I think we should look at that before we just all of a sudden agree that we should give that type of a blanket safe harbor. So, Mr. President, small businesses need help now. My colleague's correct. They need help now. But they need help far broader than this unanimous consent takes us. And there is need for negotiations in regards to the provisions that the gentleman has brought to the floor. And I can assure him that I will continue to work with Senator Rubio in a bipartisan manner. Once we get the numbers from the powers to be, that is the Speaker of the House and the Secretary of the Treasury, the administration, and our leaders, we'll put together, as we did under the CARES Act, a comprehensive program to help all small businesses, not just those struggling right now with this form, but those who can't even get the loan because they weren't eligible and they should have been eligible, or those who need additional help, or those who need the EIDL program to work well, or a microloan. We want to provide that comprehensive help now, this week, for small businesses. And this unanimous consent just doesn't get us there. So my commitment to my colleague is we're going to work with him. We're going to work with other colleagues, as we always do. And we are going to include a provision to make it easier for small businesses to get loan forgiveness, because we agree The SBA has not interpreted our law the way we wanted to. So for all those reasons, Mr. President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President,
Senator from North Dakota.
claiming my time. I appreciate Senator Cardin's commitment to working together, and we are all committed to that as well. But I do struggle a little bit when the reasons to oppose something are all the things that aren't in it. Sure, there's not support for states or local governments. There's not, new EIDL program or reformed PPP program or microloan program or tax credits. Of course, tax credits are a whole different jurisdiction. There's not nuclear modernization. There's not unemployment insurance. There are lots of things that aren't in it. But politics is the art of the possible. And around here, big packages become very difficult, and politics gets in the way. I was hoping we could find an increment to help small businesses in a significant way that, frankly, isn't going to cost the government anything. In fact, it might save them some money just in the hiring of another large bureaucracy. So I'm looking forward to working with the gentleman. I appreciate his work on the CARES Act, on PPP, his work with Chairman Rubio, with Senator Collins on creating this program. I'm just disappointed that we couldn't get it across the finish line today, and I hope we can again soon. And with that, I yield, knowing that a couple of my colleagues wanted to speak on the same topic.
Mr. President.
Senator from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank Senator Cramer and my colleague, Senator Rounds, from North Dakota to North Carolina. Businesses are struggling. And I heard what Senator Cardin said. I'm sympathetic to most of what he said. But as I travel across the state, and I've had 65 telephone town halls since COVID started, talking with citizens in North Carolina for an hour, spending 55 minutes hearing from them and answering their questions. We have a very difficult problem in North Carolina and across the country. I just talked with the Hotel and Lodging Association, Restaurant Association, just a few weeks ago. They said we have 18,000 restaurants in North Carolina. 9,000 of them are at risk of closing permanently. When we passed the CARES Act, we knew we had to do something big, bold, and fast. And I thank everyone at the Small Business Administration and the banking industry that mobilized to do something that's unprecedented. Getting that money out into the hands of businesses. The program is called the Paycheck Protection Program for a reason. We were doing everything we could to make sure that those businesses who were willing could make payroll, keep people on their benefits, keep people on their health care, try to weather the storm while closures were across this country. Closing down businesses are certainly dramatically reducing business. And thank goodness for the brave businesses that stepped up and applied for a paycheck protection loan. And thank goodness for the banks that were willing to underwrite it while we were still really working the rules out, literally building the car as it's rolling down the road. They should be commended for what they do. This measure is a simple measure. We know that more than 85% of all the loans that were underwritten under the Paycheck Protection Program are under $150,000. We know that they're small businesses. But we have a lot of paperwork that these businesses are going to have to do, and small businesses interacting with the federal government on 4 or 5 occasions before the loan is forgiven is a daunting task when you're still trying to figure out how you can make payroll and how you can keep your business going. And then you have the banking industry that we relied on for moving all this capital out there and making sure that payrolls can be met, that want to be prepared for the next tranche of CARES Act Paycheck Protection Program loans. We're going to tie them up over paperwork with these small business loans that we can forgive. And it's not like we're turning a blind eye to compliance. We'll go and look at that loan portfolio with the same sort of sampling that the IRS does to make sure if there's any fraud or abuse, that people are held accountable. If Senator Cardin really wants to get to the work of the next Paycheck Protection Program, let's lay the groundwork and clear the plumbing so that when we call on the Small Business Administration that's in the process of hiring 1,200 people just to deal with loan forgiveness. The banks that want to provide more loans need to clear the backlog so that they have the capacity to do it as fast as possible. Senator Cardin's right. We've got a lot more to do. This is a step in a long journey. By doing this forgiveness program, the measure that Senator Cardin objected to, we could have had the opportunity to take a straw off the camel's back But we've got to do something, and we've continued to have to follow up on the CARES Act. But I'm very disappointed that we've gotten to where we are in this chamber, where everybody knows this is good legislation, we should do it, and they're turning their backs on businesses, and unfortunately, I think it's going to result in more people on unemployment, more businesses closing, and I will work as hard as I can with Senator Cramer and Senator Rounds and other members to get this done. I yield the floor, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, let me thank my colleague from North Dakota for making this presentation to begin with, my colleague from North Carolina for supporting him in this action. And we appreciate the comments that the senator from Maryland has made, but we most certainly disagree with the approach that he is suggesting. Senator Cramer has suggested that we have a very serious problem here which has to be addressed. This is something that does not affect just Republican businesses, it affects all businesses. When you're talking about 4.2 million small businesses across the United States that are being impacted by this, that have borrowed money in good faith and who kept their businesses open. And now, surprisingly, when it comes time for the forgiveness portion of this to occur, we now have a very challenging process put in place, a burdensome process that could only have been done with the common sense found in Washington, D.C., and not in the rest of the country. To make the applications more difficult than to get a forgiveness than the actual application to participate in the program in the first place is simply absurd. Excuse me. Let me share with you a message from one of our bank executives in South Dakota. This is a rather prominent CEO in South Dakota. And I will share with you that I've cleaned this up a little bit. So let me paraphrase his quote to us when we asked him for information concerning how the banks are going to try to handle this. Remember, the banks didn't have to participate in this, but they did so in a way to literally get money out in a very short period of time to businesses who desperately needed the money in order to survive. First of all, they stayed on open lines of communication with the SBA literally 24/7 for more than a week, trying to get approval for individual applications that they helped small businesses to actually fill out the applications in the first place. But second of all, these banks become responsible for these loans, and unless they are forgiven, they stay with the bank. Now, how in the world can we expect these banks to go back in if we are successful in coming to an agreement on additional loans in the future being made, if we can't even follow up on our agreement that we would make this a simple process to get the loans forgiven in the first tranche that we've completed? Let me share with you what this CEO says. And this has to do with his version of what's going on, and literally we received dozens of these types of comments from bank loan officers in the upper Midwest, and particularly in South Dakota. And I paraphrase because, as I say, we had to clean this up a little bit. The forgiveness piece of the PPP is a disaster. I have 750 loans out of 1,381 under $20,000 and 50 under $2,000. They have basically the same forgiveness process as the loans of my largest borrower, which is for over $4 million. So we're asking them to fill out the same paperwork as we do a large loan recipient. And then he goes on to say, the simplified version of the PPP loan forgiveness application is not that simple. The Government Accountability Office has studied it and says it takes a borrower 15 hours to complete, and the lender 75 hours to process. Let me put that back again. 15 hours for the loan borrower to actually do the paperwork, 75 hours to process it. Our borrowers are not happy, nor are we as bankers. This is not what we signed up for in order to get disaster payments to our customers. We are trying to hold off the small businesses who borrowed under $150,000, but they are getting anxious. We, as lenders, busted our tails to get this money out, and we are getting absolutely hosed by this process. And I might add, that's not the word he used. Lenders feel as though they have really been let down. There is more than a little fatigue with the entire PPP loan forgiveness process. If we used any kind of common sense like they've got in the upper Midwest, we would have fixed this thing already. Unfortunately, it is in the middle of the political process in Washington, D.C. 4.2 million small businesses hang in the balance. Their ability to take care of a loan that we had committed, if they followed through, would be forgiven, is now in jeopardy. Time is running out. Mr. President, I appreciate the opportunity once again to support the legislation with which Mr. Cramer, Senator Cramer from North Dakota, has proposed. I hope that our colleagues on both sides of the aisle will come back and start using some of that common sense that seems to prevail in the rest of the United States, even though it is not always evident here in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.